The November fog of 1891 had settled upon London with the persistence of a guilty conscience, transforming the familiar thoroughfares into a labyrinth of shadows and whispered secrets. The yellow murk pressed against the windows of our lodgings at 221B Baker Street with such determination that even the cheerful glow of our sitting-room fire seemed diminished, as though the very light itself had grown weary of penetrating the gloom. It was upon such a morning, when the city lay muffled beneath its shroud of mist, that Inspector Lestrade arrived at our door with news of a case that would prove to challenge even the formidable deductive powers of my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. I had been occupied with the morning correspondence when Mrs. Hudson's familiar knock interrupted the comfortable silence that had settled between Holmes and myself. My companion, who had been absorbed in some chemical experiment near the window, glanced up from his apparatus with that peculiar gleam in his grey eyes that I had long since learned to associate with the promise of an intriguing puzzle. "Inspector Lestrade to see you, Mr. Holmes," announced our long-suffering landlady, her voice carrying that particular note of urgency that suggested our visitor bore news of more than routine importance. "Says it's most pressing, sir." Holmes set down his test tube with deliberate care and straightened his dressing gown, already alert to the possibilities that such an early visit might herald. "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson. Watson, you may wish to have your notebook ready. Something in Lestrade's manner of arrival suggests we are about to be presented with a problem worthy of our attention." The inspector who entered our chambers was a man transformed by frustration. Gone was his usual brisk confidence, replaced by the harried appearance of one who had encountered a mystery that defied all conventional explanation. His coat was beaded with moisture from the fog, and the prominent veins at his temples proclaimed a vexation that went far beyond mere professional inconvenience. "Good morning, Lestrade," said Holmes, settling into his chair with that predatory stillness that marked the beginning of his mental hunt. "You have the look of a man who has spent a sleepless night wrestling with the impossible. Pray, enlighten us as to the nature of your difficulty." Lestrade removed his hat and ran a hand through his thinning hair, a gesture that spoke eloquently of his state of mind. "Mr. Holmes, I've been with the Yard for 15 years, and I thought I'd seen every manner of villainy that London could produce. But this morning's work has left me questioning whether I understand the criminal mind at all." Indeed. Holmes leaned forward, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Then you have brought us something truly exceptional. Proceed." The inspector drew a deep breath and began his extraordinary tale. "The case concerns Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth, widow of the late Colonel James Ashworth of the Bengal Lancers. She returned to London this past spring following her husband's death at Peshawar, and has been residing quietly in a house in Eccleston Square. Yesterday evening, at approximately 10:30, Mrs. Ashworth retired to her bedchamber as was her custom. This morning, her lady's maid, Sarah Whitmore, found her mistress dead in her bed. "The cause?" I inquired, my medical training asserting itself. "That, Dr. Watson, is where our difficulties begin," Lestrade replied grimly. "By all appearances, Mrs. Ashworth died peacefully in her sleep. No signs of violence, no indication of struggle, no marks upon her person. Dr. Pemberton, who attended her, declared it a natural death. Heart failure, most likely, brought on by the strain of recent bereavement." Holmes's expression remained neutral, but I detected the slight narrowing of his eyes that indicated his heightened attention. "Yet you are here, Lestrade, which suggests that appearances may be deceiving. What has occurred to cast doubt upon this seemingly straightforward conclusion?" Lestrade's discomfort became more pronounced. "It's what we discovered beneath her bed, Mr. Holmes. According to the household staff, Mrs. Ashworth kept a small iron strong-box beneath her bed, a receptacle for her most precious possessions, including certain documents and jewelry that had belonged to her late husband. The box was secured with a substantial lock and was, by all accounts, quite heavy. Was. Holmes observed the past tense with characteristic precision. The strong box has vanished, Mr. Holmes, disappeared as completely as if it had never existed. But here's what defies all explanation. The room was locked from the inside. Mrs. Ashworth always fastened her door before retiring, and the key was found upon her nightstand. The windows were latched, the shutters barred from within. There is no other means of entry or exit. Holmes rose and moved to the fireplace, his tall frame silhouetted against the dancing flames. "You examined the room thoroughly?" "Every inch, sir, and that's when we made the most disturbing discovery of all." Lestrade paused, as though struggling with the implications of his own words. The floorboards beneath the bed, 3 planks, each about 2 feet in length, had been cut away with surgical precision and then replaced. Not a splinter out of place, not a mark to show how it was accomplished. It was as if the wood had been lifted by invisible hands. The fog outside seemed to press closer against our windows as the inspector's words hung in the air. I found myself struggling to comprehend the implications of what I had heard. A locked room, a vanished strongbox, and floorboards cut with impossible precision. It was a puzzle that seemed to mock the very foundations of logical deduction. Holmes turned from the fireplace, and I saw that familiar intensity burning in his grey eyes. "Lestrade, you have presented us with a most singular problem. A woman dies apparently of natural causes, yet someone, or something, has performed an act of incredible precision beneath her very bed, leaving no trace of their method or presence. Tell me, what did the servants report? Surely such work could not have been accomplished in complete silence." "That's just it, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade replied, his frustration evident. "Not a soul heard anything unusual. The house was as quiet as a tomb throughout the night. Mrs. Whitmore, the maid, sleeps in an adjoining chamber, and she swears she heard nothing beyond the usual settling of an old house." "And the missing strongbox, what did it contain?" "According to Mrs. Ashworth's solicitor, Mr. Harrington Prynne, it held various personal effects, some family jewellery, and what he described as certain private papers of a sensitive nature relating to her late husband's military service. He was quite insistent that the contents were of no monetary value to anyone outside the family." Holmes began to pace, his long strides carrying him from the fireplace to the window and back again. "Yet someone went to extraordinary lengths to obtain it. The precision of the work suggests careful planning, specialized knowledge, and considerable skill. This was no common burglary, Lestrade." As if summoned by our discussion of the case, a knock sounded at our door. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a card upon her silver tray. "A lady to see you, Mr. Holmes. Says it concerns the Ashworth matter." Holmes glanced at the card and raised his eyebrows. "Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth's sister, Miss Victoria Pembroke. Show her up immediately, Mrs. Hudson." The woman who entered our chambers was perhaps 40 years of age, dressed in deep mourning attire that spoke of recent bereavement. Her face, though marked by grief, possessed a refined intelligence, and her bearing suggested someone accustomed to society's upper circles. What struck me most forcefully, however, was the barely controlled terror that flickered behind her composed exterior. "Mr. Holmes," she began, her voice trembling despite evident efforts at composure, "I am Victoria Pembroke. I've come because I fear my sister's death was not the natural occurrence it appeared to be. There are secrets, Mr. Holmes, terrible secrets that died with Cordelia, yet someone has gone to great lengths to unearth them." Holmes gestured to a chair, his manner immediately attentive. "Please, Miss Pembroke, make yourself comfortable. You believe your sister was murdered?" "I believe she was killed for what she knew, Mr. Holmes. My sister's husband, Colonel Ashworth, died under circumstances that were never fully explained. Cordelia confided in me that she had discovered evidence, documents that suggested James's death was not the result of a native uprising, as officially reported, but something far more sinister. The pieces of the puzzle began to shift in my mind, though their ultimate configuration remained obscure." Holmes leaned forward, his entire attention focused upon our visitor. "These documents, They were kept in the strong-box beneath her bed. Miss Pembroke nodded, her hands trembling as she reached for her handkerchief. Cordelia was terrified, Mr. Holmes. She had been receiving anonymous letters for weeks, threatening messages that warned her to remain silent about her husband's death. The final letter arrived just 2 days ago. It stated simply, "The dead should remain buried. Some secrets are worth killing for." As Miss Pembroke's words echoed in our sitting room, I felt that familiar quickening of the pulse that accompanied the opening moves of one of Holmes's most challenging cases. The fog continued to swirl outside our windows, but within our chambers, the first faint glimmers of understanding began to penetrate the murk of mystery that surrounded the secret buried beneath the widow's bed. Holmes rose from his chair, his decision made. "Miss Pembroke, I shall take your case, but I must warn you that in seeking the truth about your sister's death, we may uncover facts that prove most uncomfortable. Are you prepared for such revelations?" "Mr. Holmes," she replied, straightening in her chair with a dignity that spoke well of her character, "my sister died in fear, and her killer has escaped justice through the very impossibility of their crime. Whatever the truth may be, it cannot be worse than the uncertainty that now torments me." As our new client departed into the swirling fog, Holmes turned to me with that look of keen anticipation I knew so well. "Well, Watson, we have before us a locked room, a vanished strong-box, and a dead woman who may have taken a dangerous secret to her grave. Yet someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that secret remains buried, literally, it would seem, beneath the very bed where she drew her final breath." The fog pressed against our windows like a living thing, and I found myself wondering what other secrets lay hidden in its yellow embrace, waiting to be unearthed by the relentless logic of Sherlock Holmes. The departure of Miss Pembroke left our sitting room charged with the peculiar energy that accompanies the opening moves of a complex investigation. Holmes remained by the window for several moments after the sound of her carriage had been swallowed by the fog, his sharp profile silhouetted against the grey murk that pressed against our windows. I had learned to recognize these periods of intense mental activity when his extraordinary mind began the delicate process of sorting through the initial threads of a case. "Watson," he said at length, turning from his contemplation of the fog-shrouded street, "we have before us a puzzle that appears to violate the fundamental laws of physics. A heavy strong-box vanishes from a locked room, floorboards are cut and replaced with surgical precision, yet no trace of the workman remains. Such impossibilities invariably prove to be elaborate misdirections designed to conceal a far simpler truth." I settled into my chair, notebook at the ready. Yet the precision of the work suggests considerable skill and planning. This was no common burglary, as you observed. "Indeed not. The very impossibility of the crime proclaims its calculated nature." Holmes moved to the fireplace, his long fingers drumming against the mantelpiece. "But before we examine the scene itself, let us consider what our visitors have already told us, perhaps more than they intended." He turned his penetrating gaze upon Inspector Lestrade, who had been waiting with barely concealed impatience. "Lestrade, your appearance this morning tells a most instructive tale. That grey lime wash upon your cuff, combined with the gritty white substance on your right knee, not the smooth plaster of a decorator, but the rough texture of a coal-cellar wall. The dark streak across your knuckles speaks of groping along unseen beams, while the distinct odor of creosote that clings to your greatcoat indicates pine timber treated against rot." Lestrade started, glancing down at his sleeve in surprise. "Good Lord, Holmes, I'd quite forgotten." "You have spent considerable time in the basement of the Ashworth house," Holmes continued with satisfaction. "More specifically, in a coal cellar beneath the rear rooms. The question that interests me is whether this cellar provides access to the space directly beneath Mrs. Ashworth's bedroom." The inspector's expression shifted from surprise to grudging admiration. "You're quite right, Mr. Holmes, when the constables began muttering that no man could have entered or left that room without detection. I thought to examine the lower portions of the house. There is indeed a coal cellar beneath the back drawing room, and from there a crawl space that extends under the rear portion of the house. Under the rear rooms, Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. And where, precisely, is Mrs. Ashworth's bedroom located? At the back of the house. First floor? Lestrade admitted reluctantly. Holmes clapped his hands together with evident satisfaction. Excellent. We begin to see method in our madness. The impossible becomes merely improbable when we consider that our burglars may have approached his target from below, rather than from within the locked room itself. I found myself struggling to envision the mechanics of such an operation. But Holmes, even granting access from below, how could the floorboards be cut and replaced with such precision? And more importantly, how could such work be accomplished without disturbing Mrs. Ashworth or alerting the household? Those, Watson, are precisely the questions that will lead us to our solution. Holmes reached for his coat and began to don it with purposeful efficiency. The answers lie not in theoretical speculation, but in careful examination of the physical evidence. We must see this remarkable handiwork for ourselves. The fog had begun to lift slightly as our hansom made its way through the streets toward Eccleston Square, though wisps of yellow vapor still clung to the iron railings and stone steps of the elegant Georgian houses. Holmes sat in contemplative silence during our journey, occasionally murmuring observations about the passing scene that seemed to have no bearing on our case, yet which I had learned might prove significant in ways I could not yet comprehend. The Ashworth residence presented a facade of genteel respectability, its windows dark save for a single lamp burning in the entrance hall. Inspector Lestrade met us at the front door, where a constable stood guard with the stolid patience of his profession. The interior spoke of refined taste and comfortable circumstances, though I detected an atmosphere of recent disruption that went beyond the natural disorder following an unexpected death. Holmes paused in the entrance hall, his keen gaze taking in details that escaped my notice: the precise arrangement of walking sticks in an umbrella stand, the slight displacement of a Persian rug, the particular angle at which visiting cards had been left upon a silver tray. As we ascended the main staircase, I found myself holding my breath in anticipation of what we might discover in the chamber where Mrs. Ashworth had drawn her final breath. The scene remains exactly as we found it, Lestrade assured us as we approached the bedroom door. I've had a man posted to ensure nothing has been disturbed. Holmes nodded approvingly, then paused with his hand upon the door handle. Before we enter, Lestrade, tell me, was Mrs. Ashworth in the habit of taking anything to aid her sleep? Dr. Pemberton mentioned she occasionally used a mild sleeping draught, nothing unusual for a woman of her circumstances. As the door swung open to reveal the chamber beyond, I was struck by how utterly ordinary everything appeared. The bed dominated the room, its covers still rumpled from Mrs. Ashworth's final sleep. A nightstand bore the key that had been found there, along with a water glass and a small bottle that presumably contained the sleeping preparation. Holmes approached the bed with the careful deliberation of a surgeon, his eyes scanning every detail before him. "Watson," he said suddenly, dropping to his knees beside the bed, "observe these floorboards that have caused such consternation." What I saw when Holmes lifted the edge of the carpet challenged my understanding of what was physically possible. 3 sections of flooring, each cut with mathematical precision, had been removed and replaced so expertly that only the closest examination revealed the joins. The workmanship was extraordinary, suggesting both specialized tools and considerable expertise, yet accomplished without leaving so much as a wood shaving or trace of sawdust. Holmes produced his magnifying glass and began a minute examination, his face a mask of intense concentration. "Fascinating," he murmured. "Watson, observe the angle of these cuts, the complete absence of debris. This work was not performed hastily in the dark of night. These boards were prepared in advance, shaped and fitted with the patience of a master craftsman." As Holmes continued his examination, I found myself increasingly convinced that we faced an adversary of unusual cunning and capability. The mystery of the secret buried beneath the widow's bed was proving even more complex than our initial assessment had suggested, and I could not shake the feeling that we had only begun to glimpse the true scope of the conspiracy that had claimed Mrs. Ashworth's life. "Come, Watson," Holmes said, rising from his examination with a look of grim satisfaction. "We have learned much, but there is more to discover. The basement beckons, and I suspect our coal cellar will prove most illuminating indeed." The fog continued to swirl outside the bedroom windows as we prepared to descend into the depths of the house, following a trail that led not upward toward the light, but down into the shadows where the real secrets lay waiting to be unearthed. The descent into the basement of the Ashworth residence carried us from the world of polite society into a realm where London's true secrets lay buried beneath layers of coal dust and accumulated grime. The narrow wooden stairs creaked ominously under our combined weight as Inspector Lestrade led the way with his bullseye lantern, its flickering beam casting dancing shadows across whitewashed walls that had grown dingy with decades of neglect. The air grew progressively colder and heavier as we descended, laden with the musty scent of damp stone and the acrid bite of coal smoke that seemed to permeate every surface. Holmes moved with that peculiar intensity I had learned to associate with the early stages of his most challenging cases. His keen eyes swept across every detail of our subterranean environment, cataloguing minutiae that would have escaped the notice of lesser observers. Even in this utilitarian space, far removed from the elegant drawing rooms above, his extraordinary mind was already weaving together the threads of evidence that would ultimately lead us to our quarry. The coal cellar occupied the rear portion of the basement, a cavernous space dominated by towering heaps of black fuel. Yet it was not the coal itself that immediately captured Holmes's attention, but rather the subtle signs of recent disturbance that marked the floor near the far wall. He dropped to one knee without regard for the grime, his magnifying glass appearing in his hand with practiced efficiency. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, indicating a series of faint impressions in the packed earth. "The coal dust has been disturbed here, not by the casual movement of domestic fuel, but by something far more deliberate. See these parallel tracks? Something heavy has been dragged across this floor, something with narrow wheels or runners designed to minimize both noise and effort." Lestrade peered over Holmes's shoulder, his expression growing more troubled with each revelation. "You mentioned examining the crawl space yesterday, Lestrade," Holmes continued, rising and brushing coal dust from his knees. "I trust it extends beneath the rear rooms of the house?" "Aye, Mr. Holmes. There's an opening behind those coal sacks, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. My constable had a look, but it's tight quarters and he couldn't see much without proper illumination." Holmes moved to examine the concealed opening, noting immediately that the coal sacks had been recently repositioned. The clean outline where they had previously rested against the wall told its own story of frequent access and careful concealment. More significantly, the edges of the opening itself bore traces of fresh creosote. Not the aged treatment one would expect in such a location, but the bright, sticky residue of recent application. "This creosote has been applied within the past fortnight," Holmes observed, running his finger along the treated timber. "Ostensibly to preserve the wood against rot, but more likely to mask other odors. Glue, perhaps, or the leavings of carpentry work. Someone has been using this passage with considerable regularity and has taken pains to eliminate any telltale scents that might betray their activities." Without hesitation, Holmes disappeared into the narrow tunnel, his tall frame folding with surprising grace as he adapted to the confined space. I followed with considerably less elegance, my medical bag proving an awkward burden in the cramped passage. The tunnel extended for perhaps 30 feet through rough stone and packed earth, its walls bearing the unmistakable marks of recent excavation and improvement. The passage opened into a slightly larger chamber directly beneath what I calculated must be Mrs. Ashworth's bedroom. Here, Holmes had already begun his examination, his lantern revealing evidence of extraordinary preparation and mechanical ingenuity. The ceiling above us showed the precise rectangular outline where the 3 floorboards could be accessed, but the true marvel lay in the sophisticated mechanism that had been installed to facilitate the operation. "Watson," Holmes called softly, his voice carrying that note of professional admiration reserved for truly exceptional craftsmanship. "Behold the engineer's art applied to criminal purpose." The mechanism was indeed a masterpiece of clandestine engineering. A system of precisely balanced levers and counterweights had been installed among the floor joists, allowing the 3 prepared floorboards to be lowered silently into the chamber below. The joists themselves had been modified with cabinet maker's precision, planed smooth and fitted with mortises to accommodate removable braces that would support the surrounding boards during the operation. Holmes produced his steel probe and inserted it into one of the mortises, where it struck metal with a faint click. "A seating for a removable support," he explained. "Our burglar could lower the prepared section without causing the adjacent boards to sag or creak, a consideration that speaks to both technical expertise and intimate familiarity with the acoustic properties of the house." The evidence of meticulous planning extended beyond the mechanism itself. Faint chalk marks on the stone walls recorded precise measurements, while shallow grooves in the earthen floor showed where a wheeled cart had been used to transport the heavy strong box. Most tellingly, Holmes discovered minute traces of graphite rubbed along the metal components, a professional touch designed to eliminate friction and ensure silent operation. The perpetrator came prepared for every contingency, Holmes observed, examining a pale fiber caught on a protruding nail. This felt was used to muffle any remaining sound from the mechanism. "We are dealing with someone possessing not merely criminal intent, but genuine expertise in both carpentry and mechanical engineering." As we prepared to return to the surface, Holmes paused to examine a small collection of items that had been carefully concealed behind a loose stone. Among them was an empty bottle that had once contained chloral hydrate, a powerful sleeping draught that, in sufficient quantities, could render a person unconscious for hours or, in excessive doses, prove fatal. "Watson," Holmes said grimly, holding the bottle to the light, "I fear we must consider the possibility that Mrs. Ashworth's death was not the natural occurrence it appeared to be. If our burglar required absolute silence for his work, he may have ensured it through pharmaceutical means." The implications of this discovery cast our investigation in an entirely new light. What had begun as an impossible theft was revealing itself as a carefully orchestrated murder, planned with the precision of a military operation and executed with the skill of a master craftsman. The secret buried beneath the widow's bed had indeed proven worth killing for, and our adversary had demonstrated both the capability and ruthlessness necessary to claim it. As we emerged from that subterranean chamber of secrets, the grey London afternoon seemed almost cheerful by comparison. Yet the fog that continued to swirl around the Ashworth residence now carried a more sinister aspect, as though it concealed not merely the familiar mysteries of the city, but the presence of a killer whose technical brilliance was matched only by his utter lack of conscience. "The game grows more complex, Watson," Holmes observed as we stood in the rear garden, his sharp gaze taking in the neighboring properties and potential escape routes. "We seek not merely a thief, but a murderer of exceptional capability, one who combines the skills of an engineer with the cold calculation of an assassin. The secret that lay beneath Mrs. Ashworth's bed has cost one life already, and I fear our investigation has only begun to uncover the true scope of this conspiracy." The mechanical precision of the crime spoke to advanced planning measured not in days but in weeks or months, while the sophisticated nature of the apparatus suggested access to specialized knowledge and equipment. We were hunting a predator who had transformed the very structure of the house into an instrument of murder and who had demonstrated a willingness to kill for secrets that remained tantalizingly beyond our grasp. The ascent from the basement's mechanical marvels to the civilized drawing room above carried us from the realm of criminal ingenuity back into the world of conventional investigation. Holmes immediately set about organizing the various threads of evidence we had gathered, arranging his notes and sketches across Mrs. Ashworth's writing desk with the methodical precision that marked his approach to the most complex cases. The late afternoon light, filtered through the persistent fog, cast long shadows across his work as he began to weave together the disparate elements of our extraordinary puzzle. Inspector Lestrade had not been idle during our subterranean explorations. He had assembled the household staff in the morning room, and their testimony was already revealing connections that promised to illuminate our investigation. Mrs. Cribb, the housekeeper, proved particularly valuable in her recollections of recent visitors and tradesmen who had been granted access to the lower portions of the house. "Only Mr. Cole, sir. Ezra Cole, the joiner from Sloane Street," she explained, wringing her hands nervously. "He came by Mr. Prynne's recommendation to see to a damp patch and some warping under the back drawing-room. He was here 3 times in the past fortnight." Holmes looked up from his notes with immediate interest. "When precisely, Mrs. Cribb?" 2 weeks past Tuesday, sir, again on Friday, and last Wednesday afternoon for near 2 hours. He worked mostly in the basement, said he needed to prop the joists from below." The coincidence was indeed striking. Here was a craftsman with both the skills and the access necessary to construct the elaborate mechanism we had discovered. Holmes's grey eyes gleamed with that particular intensity that marked a significant development in his reasoning. Sarah Whitmore, the lady's maid, provided additional details that proved equally illuminating. Her pale, grief-stricken face spoke eloquently of genuine affection for her deceased mistress, yet her testimony regarding Mrs. Ashworth's final evening raised troubling questions about the sleeping draught that had ensured such profound slumber. "I prepared her usual dose, sir, a teaspoon from Dr. Pemberton's bottle into her water at 10:30. She set the key by the lamp and bid me good night. She seemed no different than usual, perhaps a bit more tired." Holmes examined the medicine bottle with particular care, tilting it to the light and studying the label with his magnifying glass. "You have used this same preparation for some time?" "For a week, sir. Dr. Pemberton sent it by the boy just last Monday." The timing was suggestive. A fresh bottle of sleeping draught, delivered just days before the crime, provided an ideal opportunity for someone to ensure Mrs. Ashworth's unconsciousness during the night's elaborate proceedings. Holmes replaced the bottle thoughtfully, his expression revealing nothing of his private conclusions. Our investigation of Ezra Cole proved both illuminating and frustrating. The joiner's workshop in Cheyne Walk bore all the hallmarks of honest craftsmanship: tools arranged with care, work in progress that spoke of genuine skill, and the general atmosphere of a man who took pride in his trade. Cole himself, a compact man of perhaps 35 years, with steady eyes and capable hands, met our questions with straightforward answers that carried the ring of truth. "I did work at Eccleston Square," he confirmed without hesitation. "Damp in the joists and a loosened board. I set 2 oak props under the secondary joist to the rear of the hearth. You'll find them there still if you care to look." Lestrade's interrogation grew increasingly aggressive as he pressed the obvious case against Cole. The man had access, skills, and opportunity. His workshop contained creosote and graphite, materials we had found traces of in the basement mechanism. Yet something in Cole's demeanor suggested innocence rather than guilt. "Mr. Holmes," Cole said with quiet dignity as Lestrade prepared to arrest him, "I swear on my mother's grave I never harmed a living soul. I make things square and true. That's all." Holmes observed the arrest with that peculiar detachment that marked his deepest concentration. As Lestrade led Cole away, my friend's expression suggested reservations about the obvious solution to our puzzle. Our return to Baker Street was interrupted by the arrival of a telegram that cast our investigation in an entirely new light. Holmes tore it open with characteristic impatience, his face growing grave as he absorbed its contents. "From my contacts at the India office," he explained, passing the message to me. Colonel Ashworth's death was indeed officially attributed to a native uprising, but there were significant irregularities that were never fully investigated. The telegram revealed a conspiracy of staggering proportions. Colonel Ashworth had been investigating systematic fraud in military supply contracts, corruption that implicated not merely colonial administrators, but prominent British firms and their political connections. The uprising that claimed his life had occurred with suspicious timing, just days before he was scheduled to present his findings to his commanding officer. This revelation was followed by an unexpected visit from Mr. Harrington Prynne, Mrs. Ashworth's solicitor. The thin, nervous man who entered our sitting room bore little resemblance to the composed legal professional one might expect. His hands trembled as he removed his gloves, and his pale complexion suggested a man laboring under considerable strain. "Mr. Holmes," he began without preamble, "I fear I may have inadvertently contributed to Mrs. Ashworth's death by failing to appreciate the dangerous nature of the documents she entrusted to my care." Prynne's revelation added another layer of complexity to our investigation. Mrs. Ashworth had deposited copies of the most sensitive documents with his firm, retaining the originals in her personal strong box. Yet the previous evening, his offices had been burglarized with the same surgical precision that had marked the crime at Eccleston Square. "Nothing of obvious value was taken," Prynne explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "The safe remained untouched, as did various items of worth that lay in plain sight. However, Mrs. Ashworth's sealed packet was removed from my private filing cabinet with extraordinary precision." Holmes leaned forward with sharp interest. The same methodical approach, the same careful selection of target. Our adversary is nothing if not thorough in his work. Yet Prynne's position in the affair was not without its suspicious aspects. Under gentle questioning, he revealed that he was Mrs. Ashworth's distant cousin and had been the primary beneficiary of her estate until recently. Her decision to alter her will in favor of various charities had left him with a mere fraction of what he might have expected. Mrs. Ashworth had also been receiving visits from a gentleman claiming to represent a veterans' association. Prynne continued, seemingly eager to deflect attention from his own circumstances. She found his questions oddly specific, particularly regarding any personal effects or documents the colonel might have left behind. This mysterious visitor represented yet another thread in our increasingly complex web. A man with military bearing and intimate knowledge of Colonel Ashworth's service record, asking pointed questions about documents and personal effects. The description fitted perfectly with someone seeking to suppress evidence of the military corruption scandal. As Prynne departed into the fog-shrouded evening, Holmes turned to me with that expression of grim determination I had learned to associate with his most serious cases. "Watson, we find ourselves hunting not merely a technically proficient burglar, but the agent of a conspiracy that reaches from the battlefields of Afghanistan to the highest circles of British society." Holmes moved to the fireplace, his tall frame silhouetted against the dancing flames. "Consider the precision of our adversary's methods, the elaborate mechanism, the pharmaceutical expertise, the systematic elimination of all evidence. Yet there is something almost theatrical about the crime's impossibility, as though we were meant to marvel at its technical brilliance rather than question its ultimate purpose. You suspect misdirection. I suspect that Cole, honest craftsman though he may be, serves as an ideal scapegoat for someone with far more sophisticated motives. The very obviousness of the case against him troubles me, Watson. In my experience, the most dangerous criminals are those who provide us with convenient suspects while they themselves remain invisible." The fog pressed against our windows with renewed intensity as night settled over London, but within our sitting room, the first clear glimpses of a vast conspiracy were beginning to emerge. We faced an adversary whose technical brilliance was matched by his understanding of human nature. Someone who could construct elaborate mechanisms while simultaneously manipulating the very investigators who sought to apprehend him. The secret buried beneath the widow's bed had indeed proven worth killing for, but the true scope of the conspiracy was only beginning to reveal itself. Somewhere in the labyrinth of military connections, legal arrangements, and technical expertise lay the key to our adversary's identity, and perhaps the means to prevent the further bloodshed that seemed inevitable as long as the Colonel's dangerous discoveries remained a threat to those who had profited from his silence. "Tomorrow, Watson," Holmes said softly, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight, "we must look beyond the obvious suspects and examine the shadows they cast. Our true quarry moves with the confidence of one who believes himself beyond detection, a confidence that may yet prove his undoing." The morning brought Inspector Lestrade to our door with an air of professional satisfaction that I had rarely witnessed in our long acquaintance. The fog had lifted somewhat during the night, allowing pale shafts of November sunlight to penetrate our sitting room, where Holmes sat examining a series of chemical samples with his customary precision. The inspector's confident bearing suggested that he believed the case of Mrs. Ashworth's death to be all but concluded. "We have our man, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade announced, settling into his chair with evident pleasure. "Ezra Cole has been charged with murder and burglary. The evidence is overwhelming. His tools, his access to the house, his knowledge of carpentry, and traces of creosote and graphite found in his workshop that match the materials used in that infernal mechanism." Holmes set down his test tube and regarded the inspector with that peculiar expression of polite interest that I had learned to associate with his deepest skepticism. "Indeed, Lestrade? And his motive for constructing such an elaborate apparatus?" "Financial desperation, sir. Mrs. Ashworth had recently cancelled a substantial order for custom cabinetry, leaving Cole in dire straits. His landlord confirms he was behind in his rent, and several creditors had been pressing for payment. I confessed that the case against Cole appeared formidable, yet something in Holmes's manner suggested he remained unconvinced. The very neatness of the solution seemed to trouble him, as though he suspected that we were being presented with exactly the evidence we were meant to find. "You mentioned traces of materials in his workshop," Holmes observed. "Tell me, Lestrade, did you discover any wood shavings or sawdust that might have resulted from the cutting of those floorboards?" Lestrade's confidence wavered slightly. "Well, no, Mr. Holmes, but a careful workman would naturally clean up after himself." "Naturally. And the specialized knowledge required to construct such a mechanism. Where might a simple joiner have acquired expertise in counterweights and silent operation?" "Craftsmen learn many skills in their trade," Lestrade replied, though his tone had grown defensive. Holmes rose from his chair with that sudden decision that marked a significant development in his thinking. "Watson, your coat. We shall pay another visit to Dr. Pemberton, and then examine the scene once more. There are details that require clarification." Our interview with Dr. Pemberton proved most illuminating, though not in the manner I had anticipated. The elderly physician received us in his surgery with evident nervousness, his hands trembling as he consulted his records. When Holmes produced the medicine bottle, found at Mrs. Ashworth's bedside, the doctor's examination revealed several disturbing inconsistencies. "The label is certainly from Urquhart and Son," Dr. Pemberton confirmed, "but observe this wax seal around the cork. Urquhart employs paper caps, never wax. Moreover, the preparation I prescribed was a mild draught, 10 grains of chloral hydrate with 5 of bromide. This bottle contains a far more potent mixture." Holmes examined the bottle with his magnifying glass, noting the fresh scratches around the neck where the stopper had been repeatedly removed and replaced. "Someone has tampered with this preparation, increasing the dosage to ensure profound unconsciousness. Our victim was not merely sedated, but rendered completely insensible to the night's activities." The doctor's revelation cast the entire case in a new light. Mrs. Ashworth had not died of natural causes, but had been deliberately overdosed to facilitate the theft of her strong-box. The sleeping draught had been the first step in an elaborate murder disguised as natural death. Our return to the Ashworth residence yielded even more significant discoveries. Holmes dismissed the constable and began a minute examination of the expertly cut floorboards, his magnifying glass revealing details that had escaped our earlier inspection. What he found challenged our assumptions about the skill of the perpetrator. "Watson," he said, indicating barely perceptible variations in the saw cuts, "observe these minute inconsistencies. A master craftsman like Cole would maintain perfect uniformity throughout his work. Yet here we see fractional deviations, hesitations that suggest someone practicing an unfamiliar technique rather than employing natural skill." The evidence was subtle but unmistakable. The work was indeed of exceptional quality, but it bore the hallmarks of brilliant amateurism rather than professional craftsmanship. Someone had spent considerable time learning to replicate the skills of a master joiner, practicing until they could produce work that would implicate an innocent man while concealing their own identity. Our investigation was interrupted by the arrival of a visitor, whose appearance added another layer of complexity to our case. Captain Geoffrey Markham presented himself as a representative of the St. George's Fund, a veterans organization seeking to borrow Colonel Ashworth's military decorations for a commemorative display. His bearing was unmistakably military, his knowledge of the Colonel's service extensive and detailed. Yet Holmes's casual inquiries revealed troubling inconsistencies in the captain's story. The address he provided proved to be a gentleman's club rather than charitable offices, while his calling card bore ink that was still faintly tacky, suggesting recent and hasty printing rather than established credentials. More significantly, Captain Markham's intimate knowledge of military supply operations and colonial administration suggested connections to the very corruption that Colonel Ashworth had been investigating. His scarred face and stiff bearing spoke of genuine military service, yet his evasive responses to Holmes's questions indicated motives far removed from commemorative displays. The afternoon brought a telegram that transformed our understanding of the case's true scope. Holmes's brother Mycroft had provided information suggesting that Mrs. Ashworth's death was merely one element in a systematic campaign to eliminate witnesses to military corruption involving weapons sales to Afghan tribal leaders. The conspiracy reached into the highest levels of British society, involving not merely colonial administrators, but members of Parliament with financial interests in the firms involved. This revelation was followed by news that confirmed the pattern Holmes had begun to perceive. Major Geoffrey Hartwell, who had served under Colonel Ashworth and possessed knowledge of the supply contract irregularities, had been found dead in his lodgings, another apparent natural death that bore suspicious similarities to Mrs. Ashworth's demise. As evening approached, Holmes assembled the various threads of evidence into a coherent pattern. "Watson, we face an adversary of exceptional capability. Someone who combines technical skill with strategic thinking and access to resources that extend far beyond those of a common criminal. The precision of the crime's execution, the systematic elimination of witnesses, and the careful provision of a scapegoat all point to a mind of unusual cunning." The fog had begun to thicken once more as Holmes outlined his emerging theory. Consider the evidence. A sleeping draught tampered with by someone possessing pharmaceutical knowledge. Floorboards cut by someone who had practiced carpentry but was not a natural craftsman. And a mechanism designed by someone with engineering expertise but built to implicate an innocent joiner. We seek not Ezra Cole, but someone who has studied Cole's methods sufficiently to replicate and surpass them. Holmes moved to the fireplace, his sharp profile silhouetted against the dancing flames. The secret buried beneath the widow's bed was indeed worth killing for, but not for its monetary value. Someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to suppress evidence of military corruption that threatens to expose a conspiracy of staggering proportions. Mrs. Ashworth died not because she possessed dangerous documents, but because she represented a threat to those who profit from the very conflicts that claimed her husband's life. As the fog swirled outside our windows, concealing the movements of a killer whose technical brilliance was matched only by his ruthless efficiency, Holmes prepared for the next phase of our investigation. We had identified the true nature of our adversary and begun to understand the scope of the conspiracy, but the most dangerous phase of our work lay ahead. The systematic unmasking of a killer who had demonstrated both the capability and willingness to eliminate anyone who threatened his carefully constructed web of deception. "Tomorrow, Watson," Holmes said softly, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight. "We must move beyond the obvious suspects and examine the shadows they cast. Our true quarry believes himself beyond detection, protected by the very impossibility of his crimes. That confidence, I suspect, will prove to be his greatest vulnerability and ultimately lead to his downfall." The case of the secret buried beneath the widow's bed had revealed itself as something far more sinister than a simple theft. It was the opening move in a campaign of murder designed to protect a conspiracy that reached into the highest echelons of British society. Yet Holmes's methodical approach had begun to penetrate the elaborate deceptions, and I could sense that we were approaching the moment when the hunter would become the hunted. The 48 hours following our discovery of the basement mechanism brought a transformation in Holmes that I had witnessed only during his most challenging cases. He retreated into that peculiar state of intense mental activity that marked the final stages of his deductive process, moving through our chambers with the restless energy of a caged predator. His violin lay abandoned, his chemical apparatus gathered dust, and his usual appetite for both food and conversation disappeared entirely as his extraordinary mind grappled with the implications of what we had uncovered. I found him on the second morning standing before his makeshift reconstruction of the Ashworth bedroom mechanism. 3 planks balanced across chairs with an improvised system of weights and pulleys. His hair was disheveled, his dressing gown bore stains from various chemical experiments, and his gray eyes held that peculiar intensity that indicated a breakthrough was imminent. "Watson," he said without turning from his apparatus, "observe how the slightest adjustment in fulcrum placement affects the acoustic properties of the boards. A professional joiner would know this instinctively, would work with the natural resonance of the wood. But see here." He indicated a series of small notches cut into the planks. "These are not the elegant solutions of a craftsman, but the expedient measures of someone who has learned just enough to accomplish a specific task." His analysis was interrupted by Mrs. Hudson's announcement of an urgent visitor. Captain Geoffrey Markham entered our chambers in a state of considerable agitation, his military bearing compromised by evident exhaustion and what appeared to be a recently bandaged wound beneath his left sleeve. "Mr. Holmes," he began without preamble, "I fear my previous deception has placed us all in mortal danger. Last evening, as I returned to my lodgings, someone made a determined attempt upon my life. As I examined the captain's wound, a clean knife thrust that had fortunately missed any vital structures, his story emerged with a clarity that cast our investigation in an entirely new light. The attack had occurred in the fog-shrouded streets near his Jermyn Street lodgings, executed with the silent efficiency of a professional assassin. Only Markham's military training had enabled him to escape with his life. "The man moved with absolute precision," Markham explained, wincing as I cleaned the wound. "No words, no demands, simply the calculated efficiency of someone eliminating a threat. But his technique, Mr. Holmes, bore the hallmarks of military training rather than common criminality." Holmes leaned forward with sharp interest. "You recognize the methods?" "Field tactics learned on the northwest frontier. Silent approach, precise targeting, immediate withdrawal. This was no London cutthroat, but someone with extensive military experience." Under Holmes's gentle but persistent questioning, Captain Markham finally revealed the truth about his involvement in the case. His interest in Colonel Ashworth's effects was not commemorative, but arose from his own complicity in the supply contract irregularities that had ultimately cost the colonel his life. "I was a junior officer then," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Colonel Ashworth discovered that weapons intended for British forces were being systematically diverted to Afghan tribal leaders who paid premium prices for modern firearms. The same weapons were subsequently used against our own troops, creating a cycle of conflict that enriched the conspirators while costing countless lives. The scope of the conspiracy that emerged from Markham's confession was staggering. The operation was coordinated by someone known only as the Engineer, a sobriquet that reflected both his technical expertise and systematic approach to eliminating obstacles. This mysterious figure had orchestrated not merely the diversion of military supplies, but the subsequent elimination of anyone who threatened to expose the scheme. The Engineer's reach extends from Whitehall to the northwest frontier, Markham continued. He has demonstrated the ability to arrange accidents across 2 continents, always ensuring that investigations conclude with convenient explanations that protect the conspiracy's true scope. Holmes rose and began his characteristic pacing, his mind clearly working to integrate this new information with the evidence we had already gathered. The technical sophistication of Mrs. Ashworth's murder, the pharmaceutical knowledge required to tamper with sleeping draughts, the mechanical expertise evident in the basement apparatus, all point to someone with extensive military engineering experience. Our discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Lestrade, whose usual confidence had been replaced by evident bewilderment. He bore news that confirmed Holmes's emerging theory about the systematic nature of our adversary's campaign. "Mr. Holmes," Lestrade announced, settling heavily into his chair, "Ezra Cole has been found dead in his cell. Apparent suicide, according to the prison physician. Somehow obtained prussic acid and left a full confession admitting to Mrs. Ashworth's murder." Holmes examined the confession with his magnifying glass, immediately noting subtle inconsistencies in the handwriting. "Lestrade, this document was not written by the same hand that signed Cole's workshop receipts. Our adversary has eliminated his chosen scapegoat and provided a convenient conclusion to the official investigation." The systematic precision of the conspiracy was becoming increasingly apparent. Mrs. Ashworth had been murdered for her knowledge of military corruption. Cole had been framed and then eliminated to prevent his testimony, and now witnesses across London were facing assassination for their willingness to cooperate with our investigation. Holmes's analysis was confirmed by a series of telegrams that arrived throughout the afternoon. Major Hartwell had been found dead in his lodgings, another apparent natural death from an overdose of chloral hydrate. The medicine bottle bore the same burgundy wax seal we had discovered at the Ashworth residence, a signature that connected the crimes while simultaneously mocking conventional investigation. "The same methodical approach," Holmes observed, examining the telegram. "The same careful preparation of pharmaceutical agents, the same provision of convenient explanations. We face an adversary who has transformed murder into a systematic business practice." As evening approached, Holmes received an unexpected visitor, who provided the final piece of evidence needed to understand our adversary's true nature. Mr. Harrington Prynne arrived in a state of considerable distress, clutching a smoke-damaged ledger and bearing news of yet another attempt to eliminate evidence of the conspiracy. "My offices were burglarized last night," Prynne explained, his hands trembling as he set the ledger upon Holmes's desk. "Not for valuables, but specifically for Mrs. Ashworth's files. The intruder worked with surgical precision, removing only documents related to her case while leaving everything else untouched." Holmes examined the ledger with particular interest, noting that the burglar had attempted to destroy records of the document's existence rather than simply stealing them. "Our adversary seeks not merely to recover evidence, but to eliminate all traces that such evidence ever existed. This speaks to someone with intimate knowledge of how investigations proceed and what records might prove dangerous." The fog had begun to thicken outside our windows as Holmes assembled the various threads of evidence into a coherent pattern. "Watson, we face an adversary whose capabilities extend far beyond those of a common criminal. The engineer, as he styles himself, has demonstrated technical brilliance, pharmaceutical knowledge, mechanical expertise, and access to resources that span continents." Holmes moved to the fireplace, his sharp profile silhouetted against the dancing flames. "Consider the evidence. sleeping drafts tampered with by someone possessing pharmaceutical knowledge, floorboards cut by someone who had practiced carpentry but retained military approaches to problem solving, and a mechanism designed by someone with engineering expertise but built to implicate an innocent craftsman. "The flaw in the design is not a flaw at all," he continued, his grey eyes gleaming with understanding, "but a signature. An engineer would approach such work with mathematical precision, but a soldier trained in fieldcraft would learn just enough to accomplish the mission, perhaps using tools not perfectly suited for the task. The hesitations and expedient measures we observed speak not of amateur craftsmanship, but of military pragmatism applied to civilian problems." As the fog swirled outside our windows, concealing the movements of a killer whose technical brilliance was matched only by his ruthless efficiency, Holmes prepared for the next phase of our investigation. We had identified the true nature of our adversary and begun to understand the scope of the conspiracy, but the most dangerous phase of our work lay ahead. The systematic unmasking of a killer who had demonstrated both the capability and willingness to eliminate anyone who threatened his carefully constructed web of deception. "Tomorrow, Watson," Holmes said softly, his voice carrying that note of grim determination I had learned to associate with his most serious cases. "We must move beyond reactive investigation and begin our own campaign. The engineer believes himself untouchable, protected by the very impossibility of his crimes and the systematic elimination of witnesses. That confidence will prove to be his greatest vulnerability." The case of the secret buried beneath the widow's bed had revealed itself as something far more sinister than a simple theft. It was the opening move in a campaign of murder designed to protect a conspiracy that reached into the highest echelons of British society. Yet Holmes's methodical approach had begun to penetrate the elaborate deceptions, and I could sense that we were approaching the moment when the hunter would become the hunted. As the clock struck midnight and London settled into the embrace of fog and shadow, I found myself wondering what moves the engineer might already be planning in response to our investigation. The game had entered a new phase, one where the stakes were measured not merely in pounds and shillings, but in human lives, and where a single miscalculation might add our own names to the growing list of those who had discovered too much about the secret that lay buried beneath the widow's bed. The morning following Captain Markham's revelations found Holmes in that state of intense mental activity that I had learned to associate with the final movements of his most complex cases. He had spent the night arranging and rearranging the evidence upon his desk: maps of London, military service records, chemical analyses, and detailed sketches of the basement mechanism. The air was thick with pipe smoke, and the faint scent of his chemical experiments lingered like incense in a cathedral of deduction. "Watson," he announced as I entered with the Morning Post, "we have been dancing to our adversary's tune for far too long. The engineer has demonstrated not merely technical brilliance, but a profound understanding of how investigations proceed. He provides us with suspects, eliminates inconvenient witnesses, and manipulates evidence with the precision of a master chess player moving pieces across a board." Holmes rose from his chair with that sudden decision that marked the culmination of his deductive process. But even the most brilliant strategist can be undone by his own patterns. Our adversary's strength lies in his systematic approach, yet that very consistency has revealed his identity with startling clarity. I settled into my chair, notebook at the ready. "You have identified the engineer?" "Indeed." "Consider the evidence, Watson. Someone with advanced military engineering training, pharmaceutical knowledge sufficient to tamper with sleeping drafts, and intimate familiarity with the supply contract corruption that cost Colonel Ashworth his life." Holmes moved to the fireplace, his sharp profile silhouetted against the dancing flames. Captain Geoffrey Hartwell, not the major who was recently murdered, but his younger brother, whose death provided both the intelligence and the personal vendetta that drives this systematic campaign. The revelation struck me with the force of absolute certainty. Of course, he had access to his brother's knowledge of the investigation, military training to execute the technical aspects, and personal motivation to eliminate those he blamed for his brother's death. Precisely. Moreover, his use of Major Carstairs' identity provides the perfect cover. A respected officer whose mental breakdown conveniently placed him beyond suspicion while Hartwell operated with impunity. Holmes began his characteristic pacing. But now, Watson, we must exploit his systematic nature. The engineer believes he has eliminated all threats, yet we shall create one so immediate and personal that he cannot resist responding. Holmes's plan combined the audacious misdirection that marked his finest strategies with a profound understanding of his adversary's psychological weaknesses. We would use Mr. Harrington Prynne, Mrs. Ashworth's solicitor, as unwitting bait in a carefully constructed trap. Through Holmes's network of contacts, word would be circulated that Prynne had discovered a previously unknown cache of Colonel Ashworth's correspondence. Documents that not only detailed the corruption, but contained explicit instructions for their public dissemination. The critical element, Watson, is that these supposed documents directly threaten Hartwell's carefully constructed anonymity. Unlike the general evidence of corruption, these papers would expose the systematic elimination of witnesses and reveal the true scope of his campaign. The preparation occupied the better part of 2 days. Holmes arranged for Prynne to be seen making an appointment with Sir William Cavendish, a prominent member of Parliament known for his uncompromising stance against military corruption. The meeting was scheduled for the following evening at Cavendish's Westminster residence, and news of the appointment was allowed to filter through the appropriate channels. Meanwhile, Holmes secured an observation post in an abandoned attic room overlooking Cavendish's residence. From this vantage point, we could monitor all approaches to the house while remaining completely concealed. Holmes equipped our temporary headquarters with a powerful telescope, chemical analysis equipment, and various implements that suggested he anticipated more than mere observation. "Our adversary is methodical, Watson," Holmes reminded me as we settled into position on the evening of the supposed meeting. "He will scout the location, assess the risks, and plan his approach with the same precision he applied to Mrs. Ashworth's murder. We seek the flaw in his design, the moment when military pragmatism betrays itself through civilian disguise." The night passed in tense surveillance, broken only by the occasional rumble of late carriages and the distant chiming of Westminster's church bells. Holmes maintained his vigil with the patience of a predator, his keen eyes scanning every shadow and movement through the telescope. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with shades of grey and rose, our patience was rewarded. A figure emerged from the morning fog with movements too precise for his working-class disguise. Holmes immediately trained his telescope upon the man, noting the telltale signs that betrayed his true nature. Calloused hands that spoke of precision tools rather than manual labor, a gait that retained the measured cadence of military training, and most significantly, traces of that distinctive burgundy wax upon his coat cuff. "Captain Geoffrey Hartwell," Holmes murmured with grim satisfaction, believing himself invisible while planning another surgical elimination. Observe his reconnaissance, Watson, the same systematic approach that served him so well in Mrs. Ashworth's murder. Hartwell spent nearly an hour examining Cavendish's residence with professional thoroughness. He assessed potential entry points, escape routes, and the acoustic properties of the surrounding streets. His movements betrayed the mind of a military engineer adapted to clandestine operations, someone who had transformed the skills of siege warfare into the tools of systematic assassination. Holmes waited until Hartwell had completed his reconnaissance and begun to withdraw before making his move. "Now, Watson, we have observed the predator at work. It is time to spring our trap." The confrontation unfolded with the swift precision that marked Holmes's most audacious captures. As Hartwell moved through a narrow alley behind Cavendish's residence, Holmes appeared at one end while Inspector Lestrade and his constables blocked the other. The military engineer found himself trapped, with no avenue of escape save through direct confrontation. Hartwell's response revealed both his training and his desperation. Rather than surrender, he produced from his coat a small glass ampule, undoubtedly containing the same prussic acid he had used to silence Ezra Cole. Holmes's walking stick intercepted the motion with practiced efficiency, sending the deadly vials shattering harmlessly against the alley wall. "Captain Geoffrey Hartwell," Holmes announced formally, "you are under arrest for the murders of Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth, Major Geoffrey Hartwell, and Ezra Cole, as well as conspiracy to defraud His Majesty's forces through the systematic diversion of military supplies." The man, who had styled himself the engineer, regarded us with the calm assessment of a professional soldier evaluating an unfavorable tactical situation. His scarred face showed no emotion, yet something in his eyes suggested a mind calculating final options with the same methodical precision that had marked his criminal campaign. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said quietly, his voice carrying the cultured tones of an educated officer, "I confess myself impressed by your systematic approach to this investigation. You have demonstrated that even the most carefully planned operation can be undone by superior intelligence and patient observation." As Lestrade's constables secured the prisoner, Holmes examined the contents of Hartwell's satchel with professional interest. Among the items were additional ampules of prussic acid, a set of precision tools that could accomplish the delicate carpentry work we had observed, and most significantly, a detailed map of London marked with the addresses of other potential witnesses to the supply contract corruption. "The campaign was far from over, Watson," Holmes observed grimly. "We have captured the engineer, but the conspiracy he served extends into the highest levels of British society. This arrest marks not the conclusion of our investigation, but merely the end of its most dangerous phase." As the fog began to lift from Westminster's ancient streets, revealing the full scope of the conspiracy that had claimed so many lives, I found myself reflecting on the systematic precision with which one man's quest for vengeance had nearly succeeded in burying the truth forever. The secret that lay beneath the widow's bed had indeed proven worth killing for, but Holmes's relentless pursuit of justice had finally brought the engineer's campaign to its inevitable conclusion. The case of Mrs. Ashworth's impossible murder was solved, yet the broader implications of what we had uncovered would continue to reverberate through the corridors of power for months to come. Captain Geoffrey Hartwell's systematic elimination of witnesses had failed in its ultimate purpose, and the corruption that had cost Colonel Ashworth his life would finally face the light of public scrutiny. "Come, Watson," Holmes said as we prepared to leave our observation post. "We have work yet to do. The engineer may be captured, but the machinery of corruption he served continues to operate. Our investigation has only begun to expose the full scope of the conspiracy that reaches from the battlefields of Afghanistan to the drawing rooms of Mayfair." The morning sun broke through the dissipating fog as we made our way back to Baker Street, carrying with us the satisfaction of justice served and the sobering knowledge that even the most impossible crimes yield to patient observation and methodical deduction. The secret buried beneath the widow's bed had been unearthed at last, but the broader mysteries it revealed would require all of Holmes's considerable abilities to fully resolve. The interrogation room at Scotland Yard had witnessed countless confessions over the years, but rarely had it contained a prisoner who regarded his captors with such calculated composure. Captain Geoffrey Hartwell sat with the rigid bearing of a professional soldier, his scarred hands folded precisely upon the wooden table, his grey eyes assessing Holmes and myself with the same methodical attention he had once applied to surveying enemy positions on the northwest frontier. Holmes arranged his evidence with deliberate care, the burgundy wax seal, fragments of the basement mechanism, chemical analyses of the tampered sleeping draught, and detailed sketches of the impossible crime scene. Each item was placed with the precision of a chess master positioning pieces for a decisive gambit, while Hartwell observed with the detached interest of one professional acknowledging another's expertise. "You will not find this a simple matter to prove in court, Mr. Holmes," Hartwell said quietly, his voice carrying the cultured tones of an educated officer. "Circumstantial evidence and theoretical reconstructions, however brilliant, do not constitute legal proof of murder." Holmes leaned back in his chair, his grey eyes gleaming with that particular intensity I'd learned to associate with his most complete victories. "On the contrary, Captain, your systematic approach to elimination has provided us with a remarkably clear pattern of evidence. Shall we examine it together?" The detective produced the medicine bottle found at Mrs. Ashworth's bedside, its burgundy wax seal catching the gaslight. This preparation was tampered with by someone possessing both pharmaceutical knowledge and access to Urquhart & Sons sealing materials. The dosage was increased from Dr. Pemberton's prescribed 10 grains of chloral hydrate to nearly 30, sufficient to ensure not merely deep sleep, but death from respiratory depression. Hartwell's expression remained neutral, but I detected the slightest tightening around his eyes. Holmes continued with relentless precision. "The basement mechanism reveals the hand of a military engineer, someone trained in precision construction but lacking the intuitive craftsmanship of a professional joiner. The minute inconsistencies in the saw cuts, the expedient solutions rather than elegant ones, all point to learned skill rather than natural aptitude." Holmes rose and began his characteristic pacing, his tall frame casting shifting shadows in the lamplight. "But the true genius of your campaign, Captain, lay not in the technical execution, but in the psychological misdirection. You provided us with Ezra Cole, a man with means, motive, and opportunity, while concealing your own involvement through the very impossibility of the crime." The door opened to admit Inspector Lestrade, followed by Mr. Harrington Prynne and Captain Markham, both summoned to witness what Holmes had termed the final movement of our investigation. Hartwell regarded the assembled group with the same calm assessment, his military bearing unchanged despite the mounting evidence. Holmes addressed the broader audience with the measured cadence of a professor delivering a crucial lecture. "Gentlemen, we have before us not merely a murderer, but the architect of a conspiracy that extends from the battlefields of Afghanistan to the drawing rooms of Mayfair. Captain Hartwell's systematic elimination of witnesses was designed to protect a supply contract, fraud that cost countless British lives while enriching its perpetrators." The detective moved to a map of London that had been prepared for the occasion, marking locations with red pins. Mrs. Ashworth's murder was preceded by the deaths of Major Geoffrey Hartwell, the captain's own brother, and followed by the elimination of Ezra Cole, whose suicide provided a convenient conclusion to the official investigation. Each death bore the same pharmaceutical signature, the same methodical planning, the same careful provision of alternative explanations. Prynne shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "But Mr. Holmes, how could one man orchestrate such an extensive campaign? The resources required, the coordination across continents?" "An excellent question," Holmes replied, producing a telegram from his coat. "This morning's communication from my brother Mycroft reveals that Captain Hartwell was not working alone, but as part of a network that includes serving officers, government officials, and prominent businessmen. The conspiracy required someone with both military expertise and insider knowledge, someone who could eliminate threats while maintaining the appearance of natural deaths." Holmes turned his penetrating gaze upon Hartwell, who had remained silent throughout the exposition. "Your brother discovered the truth about the supply contract fraud and was murdered for his integrity. You, Captain, chose a different path, joining the conspiracy that killed him, perhaps initially for revenge, but ultimately becoming its most effective agent." For the first time, Hartwell's composure showed signs of strain. "You speak of things you cannot possibly understand, Mr. Holmes. The realities of colonial administration, the necessities of frontier warfare. I understand systematic murder disguised as patriotic necessity," Holmes interrupted sharply. "I understand weapons diverted to tribal leaders who used them against British troops, creating casualties that justified increased military expenditure and further contracts for the conspirators. Your brother died trying to expose this betrayal. You chose to profit from it." The silence that followed was broken by the arrival of Mycroft Holmes, whose considerable bulk filled the doorway as he surveyed the scene with his characteristic air of languid authority. His presence immediately transformed the atmosphere, lending governmental weight to what had been a criminal investigation. "Gentlemen," Mycroft announced in his measured tones, "I bring word from the highest levels of Her Majesty's government. The evidence assembled by my brother has been reviewed by those with authority to act upon it. Captain Hartwell will face charges not merely for murder, but for high treason in connection with the systematic betrayal of British military interests." Hartwell's military bearing finally cracked, his face showing the strain of a man who had played a desperate game and lost. "The system was already corrupt," he said quietly. "I merely chose to work within its realities rather than die opposing them as my brother did." Holmes regarded the broken man with something approaching compassion. "Yet in choosing to work within corruption, you became its most efficient instrument. Mrs. Ashworth died not because she threatened the conspiracy's profits, but because she represented the possibility that truth might yet prevail over systematic deception." As Hartwell was led away to face charges that would likely end at the gallows, Holmes turned to address the remaining witnesses. "The secret buried beneath the widow's bed has been unearthed, but the broader conspiracy it revealed will require months of careful investigation to fully expose. We have captured one architect of systematic murder, but the network that employed him extends into the highest circles of British society." The fog had begun to thicken outside Scotland Yard's windows as Holmes and I prepared to return to Baker Street. Our investigation had revealed not merely the solution to an impossible crime, but the existence of a form of institutional betrayal that challenged the very foundations of imperial administration. "Watson," Holmes said as our hansom navigated the fog-shrouded streets, "we have witnessed the transformation of individual greed into systematic evil. Captain Hartwell's technical brilliance was employed not in service of his country, but in the elimination of those who would hold it accountable for its betrayals. The case of Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth's murder was solved, but the broader implications of what we had uncovered would continue to resonate through the corridors of power for years to come. The impossible crime had been revealed as the work of a very possible killer, whose military expertise had been perverted into an instrument of murder, and whose systematic approach had nearly succeeded in burying the truth forever." As we settled into our familiar chairs before the fireplace at 221B Baker Street, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary scope of the conspiracy we had helped to expose. The secret buried beneath the widow's bed had indeed proven worth killing for, but Holmes's relentless pursuit of justice had finally brought the truth to light, ensuring that those who had profited from betrayal would face the consequences of their systematic evil. "The game, Watson," Holmes observed with quiet satisfaction, "has reached its natural conclusion. Yet I suspect the reverberations of what we have uncovered will continue to be felt long after Captain Hartwell has faced his final accounting." The fog pressed against our windows like a living thing, but within our sitting room, the warmth of justice served and truth revealed provided a bulwark against the shadows that had so recently threatened to engulf us all. The days following Captain Hartwell's arrest brought a peculiar mixture of relief and unease to our investigation. The fog that had shrouded London throughout our case seemed reluctant to lift entirely, clinging to the streets and buildings as though the very atmosphere retained some memory of the secrets that had been so recently unearthed. Holmes moved through this period with that restless energy I had learned to associate with cases that, while ostensibly solved, continued to trouble his methodical mind. Inspector Lestrade arrived at Baker Street on the third morning bearing news that cast our recent victory in a more complex light. "Mr. Holmes," he announced, settling into his familiar chair with evident weariness, "we've had developments from Portsmouth and Dover. 2 more officers with knowledge of Colonel Ashworth's investigation have been found dead. Apparent natural causes, but given recent events, the Admiralty is requesting a full review." Holmes set down his morning correspondence and regarded the inspector with that sharp attention that marked significant developments. The same methodical approach, I presume? The same convenient medical explanations? Aye, sir, and what's more troubling, each man had recently been approached by someone claiming to represent a Veterans Memorial Committee, asking specific questions about their service records and any personal effects from deceased comrades. This revelation confirmed what Holmes had begun to suspect, that Captain Hartwell, for all his technical brilliance, had been merely one instrument in a far more extensive campaign. The conspiracy we had uncovered reached beyond a single vengeful officer into the systematic elimination of witnesses across multiple theaters of operation. Our understanding of the case's true scope was transformed by an unexpected discovery that morning. Miss Victoria Pembroke arrived at our chambers in a state of considerable distress, bearing news that would ultimately provide the key to unraveling the conspiracy's deepest secrets. "Mr. Holmes," she began, her voice trembling despite evident efforts at composure. "I've been sorting through Cordelia's effects, and I fear we may have overlooked something of crucial importance. My sister was far more cunning than any of us realized." Holmes leaned forward with immediate interest. "Indeed, Miss Pembroke. What have you discovered?" "It concerns the strongbox that was stolen so elaborately from beneath her bed. I believe it served a purpose quite different from what we assumed." She paused, gathering her courage. "Cordelia confided in me, shortly before her death, that she had grown suspicious of everyone, even her own solicitor. She spoke of placing her trust not in locks and strongboxes, but in places where only she would think to look." Holmes rose with that sudden decision that marked a breakthrough in his reasoning. "Watson, your coat. Miss Pembroke, you will accompany us to Eccleston Square immediately. I suspect your sister's final gambit is about to be revealed." The return to Mrs. Ashworth's bedroom carried us back into the heart of our investigation's most intimate mysteries. The room had been left largely undisturbed since our previous examinations, the carpet still drawn back to reveal the precisely cut floorboards that had so baffled conventional investigation. Yet Holmes paid these familiar features scant attention, focusing instead on elements we had previously overlooked. "Miss Pembroke," he said, approaching the substantial four-poster bed that dominated the chamber, "your sister was a woman of intelligence and foresight. She understood that her adversaries would expect conventional hiding places, safes, strong boxes, locked drawers. But consider the psychology of a woman who had learned to fear the very ground beneath her feet." Holmes knelt beside the bed's front right post, his keen eyes examining the brass fittings with characteristic intensity. The bedposts were of turned mahogany, their polished surfaces bearing the patina of decades of careful maintenance. Yet as Holmes applied his magnifying glass to the junction where post met base, I observed him pause with that peculiar stillness that indicated a significant discovery. "Watson, your penknife," he requested, his voice carrying that note of controlled excitement that marked his most important revelations. With surgical precision, Holmes worked at what appeared to be a nearly invisible seam in the bedpost's varnish. A whisper of sound, the softest parting of old resin, and a section of the post's base revolved upon hidden threads. The entire lower portion came free, revealing a cunningly hollowed cylinder that extended deep into the heart of the wood. Within this secret compartment lay a roll of papers, wrapped in oiled silk and bound with narrow tape. The preservation was perfect, the documents showing no signs of the dampness that might have compromised papers stored in more obvious locations. As Holmes carefully extracted the packet, Miss Pembroke gripped the bedstead with white knuckles. "Cordelia," she whispered, her composure finally breaking. "Oh, Cordelia, you trusted no one but yourself." Holmes spread the documents across Mrs. Ashworth's writing desk with reverent care. What we discovered there transformed our understanding not merely of the immediate conspiracy, but of the systematic corruption that had cost Colonel Ashworth his life. Here were detailed memoranda in the colonel's bold military hand, accompanied by shipping manifests, altered bills of lading, and correspondence bearing the letterheads of respected London firms whose very respectability had shielded them from suspicion. The scope of the betrayal revealed in these documents was staggering. Colonel Ashworth had documented a network that extended from regimental quartermasters to members of Parliament, all profiting from conflicts they themselves helped perpetuate. Weapons purchased for British forces were systematically diverted to Afghan tribal leaders, creating the very conflicts that justified increased military expenditure and further profitable contracts. "Watson," Holmes observed grimly, "we see here not merely theft, but the systematic transformation of British military policy into an instrument of private enrichment. These men have not stolen from the Crown, they have actively conspired in the deaths of their own countrymen." Our examination was interrupted by the arrival of Mycroft Holmes, whose considerable presence immediately transformed the atmosphere of the investigation. His languid manner could not entirely conceal the gravity with which he regarded the documents spread before us. "Sherlock," he said without preamble, "I bring word from the highest levels of government. The evidence you have assembled has been reviewed by those with authority to act upon it. The conspiracy reaches further than even we suspected. Into the India Office, the War Department, and certain commercial interests whose influence extends into Parliament itself." The revelation that followed cast our investigation in an entirely new light. The burgundy wax seal that had marked Hartwell's victims was not merely a killer's signature, but a symbol used by the conspiracy's leadership to mark the elimination of threats. Each murder had been authorized at the highest levels, with Hartwell serving as the technical expert who could accomplish the impossible while maintaining plausible deniability. Holmes examined the correspondence with particular attention to dates and signatures. The systematic nature of the campaign becomes clear when viewed in this context. Mrs. Ashworth's murder was not an isolated act of vengeance, but part of a coordinated effort to eliminate all witnesses to the supply contract fraud. As afternoon faded into evening, Holmes assembled the various threads of evidence into a coherent narrative that revealed the conspiracy's true scope. The stolen strongbox had indeed contained copies of incriminating documents, but Mrs. Ashworth's true masterstroke lay in her recognition that the most dangerous secrets required the most unexpected hiding places. She understood, Holmes explained to our assembled group, that her adversaries would calculate every conventional possibility. Safes, banks, solicitors' offices. But who would think to examine the very bed in which she slept? The strongbox served as both decoy and proof of concept, drawing attention away from the true repository of evidence. The fog had begun to thicken outside the bedroom windows as Holmes prepared to coordinate with the authorities for the systematic exposure of the conspiracy. Yet even as we prepared to leave that chamber where so much had been hidden and finally revealed, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary courage of a woman who had faced her own death with such calculated defiance. Miss Pembroke approached the writing desk where her sister's final testament lay spread in the lamplight. "She told me once," she said softly, "that the truth must be placed where it could not be reached from below." I thought she meant spiritually, that truth resided in higher principles, but she meant it quite literally, didn't she? Holmes permitted himself one of his rare smiles. "Your sister possessed a mind worthy of her husband's memory, Miss Pembroke. She understood that the most effective hiding place is often the most obvious one, provided it requires the correct perspective to perceive it." As we prepared to leave Eccleston Square for what I suspected would be the final time, Holmes paused at the threshold of Mrs. Ashworth's bedroom. The fog swirled outside her windows, but within that chamber, the truth had finally been brought to light through the foresight of a woman who had refused to let her husband's sacrifice be buried beneath layers of official deception. The secret buried beneath the widow's bed, Holmes observed quietly, was not hidden in the floor, but in the bed itself, in the very foundation of her final refuge. Mrs. Ashworth understood that her adversaries would think like engineers and soldiers, calculating weights and structural possibilities. She thought like a woman who had learned that the most profound truths are often hidden in the most intimate spaces. The case was approaching its resolution, but the broader implications of what we had uncovered would reshape British colonial policy for years to come. The impossible crime had revealed the existence of a very possible conspiracy, whose systematic evil had nearly succeeded in burying the truth forever beneath the calculated precision of military engineering and political influence. As our hansom carried us back through the fog-shrouded streets toward Baker Street, I found myself marveling at the extraordinary journey that had brought us from a locked room, mystery to the exposure of institutional betrayal on an unprecedented scale. The widow's bed had indeed concealed a secret worth killing for, but Mrs. Ashworth's final gambit had ensured that the truth would survive even her own carefully orchestrated murder. "Tomorrow, Watson," Holmes said as the familiar gaslight of our lodgings appeared through the swirling fog, "we begin the systematic dismantling of a conspiracy that has cost countless lives while enriching its perpetrators. The documents Mrs. Ashworth preserved will serve as the foundation for prosecutions that will echo through the corridors of power for years to come." The fog pressed against our windows as we settled before the fire, but within our sitting room, the warmth of truth finally triumphant provided a bulwark against the shadows that had so recently threatened to engulf us all. The secret buried beneath the widow's bed had been unearthed at last, not through force or clever mechanism, but through the foresight of a woman who had understood that the most dangerous truths require the most unexpected sanctuaries. The weeks following Captain Hartwell's arrest transformed London from a city shrouded in fog to one illuminated by the harsh glare of public scrutiny. The systematic exposure of the conspiracy that had claimed Mrs. Ashworth's life sent shockwaves through the highest echelons of British society as Mycroft Holmes orchestrated a careful campaign to dismantle the network of corruption while preserving the stability of essential institutions. The fog that had concealed so many secrets seemed at last to lift permanently, as though the very atmosphere had been purged by the revelation of such systematic deception. Holmes spent the initial days in intense collaboration with his brother, coordinating the methodical exposure of evidence with those governmental authorities who remained untainted by the conspiracy's influence. The documents preserved within Mrs. Ashworth's bedpost provided the foundation for prosecutions that would ultimately reach from regimental quartermasters to members of Parliament, each arrest revealing new connections in a web of corruption that had transformed military policy into an instrument of private enrichment. The trial of Captain Geoffrey Hartwell at the Old Bailey provided the public face for what the newspapers inevitably dubbed the Afghan supply scandal. The courtroom had rarely witnessed testimony of such technical complexity as Holmes methodically reconstructed the impossible crime that had claimed Mrs. Ashworth's life. With characteristic precision, he demonstrated how military engineering expertise had been perverted into an instrument of murder, creating impossibilities designed to conceal the most systematic of betrayals. Holmes's testimony, delivered with that clarity which had made him legendary among London's legal community, held the courtroom transfixed. Using working models and chemical analysis, he proved beyond doubt that the impossible crime was merely the application of military problem-solving to civilian circumstances. The defendant approached Mrs. Ashworth's murder as he would a siege operation, Holmes explained to the fascinated jury. He identified the objective, assessed the defensive measures, and constructed a solution that would achieve his goal while maintaining plausible deniability. The very impossibility of the crime served as its most effective camouflage. Hartwell's own testimony revealed the psychological transformation of a man who had begun seeking justice for his brother's murder, but had ultimately become an architect of the very corruption he had initially opposed. His military bearing, maintained throughout the proceedings, served only to emphasize the tragedy of capabilities so thoroughly misdirected. I learned to work within the system's realities. he stated with characteristic directness, rather than die opposing them as Geoffrey did. The weapons were being diverted regardless of my actions. I chose to profit from inevitabilities rather than perish fighting impossibilities. The verdict, when it came, surprised no one who had followed the methodical presentation of evidence. Captain Geoffrey Hartwell was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to death, though his execution would mark merely the beginning of the broader reckoning that would follow. The judge, in pronouncing sentence, spoke of the perversion of skill, words that caused Holmes to stir as if the phrase had touched some deeper understanding within him. The resolution of individual cases, however, provided opportunities for justice that extended beyond mere punishment. Inspector Lestrade, whose initial frustration with the impossible crime had evolved into deep appreciation for Holmes's methods, took particular satisfaction in the posthumous exoneration of Ezra Cole. The joiner's suicide was officially declared murder, and a modest subscription, begun by Holmes and quietly supplemented by Mycroft, secured for Cole's aged mother a small annuity and for his apprentice the tools that would allow him to inherit the little shop. Miss Victoria Pembroke bore herself throughout the proceedings with a dignity that moved all who encountered her. Standing by our window one afternoon, amidst the clatter of Marylebone traffic, she spoke softly of her sister's extraordinary foresight. Cordelia was not clever so much as steady, Dr. Watson. She learned by degrees that no lock of iron was proof against those who live by iron. So she made a lock of trust and habit, something no man with a saw could carry away in his sleeve. Holmes, who rarely pays compliments, bowed with grave respect. Your sister designed a defense suited not to timber, but to human nature. It was the one material our adversary undervalued. Captain Markham, whose initial deception had nearly cost him his life, emerged as a key witness for the Crown. His intimate knowledge of the corruption, combined with his personal experience of Hartwell's ruthlessness, provided invaluable testimony. When the trials concluded, he approached Holmes with quiet dignity. I shall continue to give evidence, sir. It will not restore the dead, but it may restore something that can be built again. Holmes inclined his head. Truth, Captain, is the only artificer that builds upon ruins. Of Mr. Harrington Prynne, the solicitor, there was less to say, yet something to be set right. He had been unworthy but not vicious, admitting under pressure that he had disclosed certain facts about Mrs. Ashworth's habits to a caller, styling himself from a veterans' association. He thought to save his practice, Holmes remarked as we sat alone. He will now be made to serve the truth rather better than he served his client. There is a punishment in continued usefulness, Watson, when a man would prefer to bury his face. The broader consequences of our investigation extended far beyond individual prosecutions. Names once spoken with deference were translated into file numbers as Mycroft's careful orchestration ensured that the evidence reached those with authority to act upon it. The systematic betrayal of British military interests, documented with such precision in Colonel Ashworth's own hand, sparked parliamentary inquiries that would ultimately lead to comprehensive reforms in colonial administration and military procurement. Yet the most profound transformations occurred in those discrete forms of justice by which a country saves itself from too sudden a confession of error. A director departed for Madeira in ill health. A member accepted an office of profit under the Crown in some happily distant colony. Holmes observed these developments without rejoicing, yet also without rage. "The wheel cannot be remade in a day," he said, filling his pipe by the fire. "It is enough for the present that the cog which bit flesh is removed." One final ceremony remained to complete our involvement in the case. On a raw morning of sleet and slate-colored sky, we stood with a small group at Kensal Green while Mrs. Ashworth's remains were committed beside her husband's stone, newly inscribed. A modest wreath of laurel bore a simple card, "From comrades who served under Colonel James Ashworth." No name was attached. Miss Pembroke, pale but composed, placed beneath it a spray of winter flowers, while Captain Markham stood at a respectful distance in plain black, his arm still stiff beneath the sleeve. As the mourners dispersed and we prepared to return to Baker Street, Holmes offered one of his rare reflections on the moral dimensions of our work. "Watson, we have witnessed the transformation of individual vengeance into systematic evil, yet also the triumph of individual courage over institutional corruption. Mrs. Ashworth's final gambit succeeded not merely in preserving evidence, but in demonstrating that truth can survive even the most calculated attempts at its suppression." The fog had entirely lifted from London streets as our hansom carried us back through the familiar thoroughfares. The autumn sunlight, filtered through the city's usual haze of coal smoke and commerce, seemed somehow cleaner than it had during the dark days of our investigation. Our sitting room welcomed us with its familiar comfort, the chemical apparatus gleaming in the afternoon light, the violin resting in its accustomed place, and the morning's correspondence arranged with Mrs. Hudson's customary precision. Holmes settled into his chair with evident contentment, reaching for his pipe with the measured movements of one whose mind had found resolution to its most challenging puzzles. "The case of the secret buried beneath the widow's bed has reached its natural conclusion, Watson. The impossible crime has been revealed as the work of a very possible killer, whose military expertise was perverted into an instrument of murder, and whose systematic approach nearly succeeded in burying the truth forever." As evening approached and the familiar sounds of London settled into their daily rhythms, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had carried us from a locked room mystery to the exposure of institutional betrayal on an unprecedented scale. The technical brilliance of the crime had ultimately served to expose the systematic nature of the corruption it was designed to protect, while Mrs. Ashworth's extraordinary foresight had ensured that her husband's sacrifice would not be forgotten. Holmes produced a small scrap of burgundy sealing wax from his pocket, examining it in the lamplight. "A token, Watson, of our late adversary's vanity. You observed how often he returned to that color. I confessed I had thought it mere affectation. It was more, a private stamp of order imposed upon chaos. Hartwell believed the world could be engineered into sense by will, and when it resisted, he planed it smooth. The bedpost undid him, the one place where design yielded to instinct and caution to courage." The clock struck 6 as Holmes rose with that familiar energy that marked the conclusion of his most satisfying cases. "Come, Watson. Mrs. Hudson has promised us a particularly fine dinner this evening, and I believe we have earned the luxury of an evening devoted to simpler pleasures. All London cannot forever be an engineer's diagram, and there is, I am informed, a violin maker in Wimpole Street who has acquired a Neapolitan instrument that may yet render justice to my interpretation of Sarasate." The gaslight flickered against our windows as London embraced the approaching night, but within our sitting room at 221B Baker Street, the warmth of truth triumphant and justice served provided a perfect refuge from whatever shadows might yet lurk in the city's ancient streets. The case of the secret buried beneath the widow's bed had reached its resolution, revealing that the most profound truths are often hidden in the most intimate and unexpected places, waiting to be discovered by those with the patience to look beyond the obvious and the courage to pursue justice wherever it might lead. As we prepared to close this chapter of our investigative partnership, Holmes paused at the threshold of our sitting room, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight. "The game, Watson, is never truly concluded. There are always new puzzles, new villains, and new secrets waiting to be unearthed. But tonight, perhaps, we may rest in the satisfaction that Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth's courage has not been forgotten, and that the truth she died to preserve has finally seen the light of day." The fog had lifted, the impossible had been explained, and justice had been served. Yet the memory of a woman's extraordinary foresight in the face of systematic evil would remain with us always, a reminder that even the most carefully buried secrets must eventually yield to the patient application of reason and the unwavering pursuit of truth. The winter of 1892 had settled upon London with a peculiar clarity, as though the fog that had so persistently shrouded our investigation had been permanently banished by the light of truth. The headlines that had blazed across the front pages during the trials had gradually given way to the more measured prose of parliamentary reports and administrative reforms. Yet the reverberations of what the press had dubbed the Afghan supply scandal continued to reshape the very foundations of British colonial policy. Holmes had returned to his customary pursuits with characteristic detachment from the public acclaim that inevitably followed such a dramatic resolution. I would often find him absorbed in some obscure chemical analysis or lost in the complexities of a Bach fugue, as though the recent triumph was merely a solved equation, already consigned to the annals of completed work. The clamor of congratulatory letters, the visits from grateful officials, and even the discreet expressions of appreciation from the highest levels of government barely registered with his restless intellect. It was on such a morning, with pale February sunlight streaming through our sitting-room windows, that Inspector Lestrade paid us what would prove to be a significant visit. His bearing had acquired a new confidence, and I noted immediately the subtle changes that spoke of professional advancement. The better cut of his coat, the gold thread in his watch chain, and most tellingly, the leather portfolio that suggested expanded responsibilities. "You'll have seen the announcement in the Gazette, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade began, settling into his familiar chair with evident satisfaction. "Chief Inspector, effective immediately." The Commissioner was most complimentary about our work on the Ashworth matter. Holmes waved the congratulations aside with characteristic modesty. "Well deserved, Lestrade. Your systematic examination of the physical evidence provided the foundation upon which all subsequent deductions were built." Lestrade's expression grew more serious as he produced a small wrapped package from his portfolio. "There's something else, sir. We've completed the final arrangements for Ezra Cole, a proper headstone paid for by private subscription. Your brother was generous in his contribution." The package contained a daguerreotype of the modest granite marker, bearing the simple inscription, "Ezra Cole, Master Joiner." His work was square and true. Holmes examined it with that careful attention he reserved for evidence of moral significance. "The stone should outlast the scandal, Lestrade," he observed quietly. "That will be justice enough." Our conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Hudson's announcement of Miss Victoria Pembroke, who entered our chambers with the composed dignity that had marked her bearing throughout our investigation. She was dressed in half-mourning now, the deep black of her earlier visits replaced by grey silk that suggested the gradual healing of grief without the abandonment of memory. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she began, settling gracefully into the chair Holmes offered. "I've come to express my gratitude once more, and to share news that I believe would have pleased Cordelia greatly." She produced a letter written on thin paper that bore the unmistakable marks of distant travel. "This arrived yesterday from India, from a Subadar Hari Singh who served under my brother-in-law. He writes that news of the trials has reached his regiment, and that there is great satisfaction among the native officers that Colonel Ashworth's honor has been vindicated." Holmes read the letter with evident interest, noting the careful English and dignified sentiment. "Your sister's sacrifice has been acknowledged in 2 languages, Miss Pembroke. Some truths travel more directly than ships." As Miss Pembroke prepared to depart, she paused at our window where the February light cast gentle shadows across her features. "I wish to tell you that the bed has been taken down at last. I could not bear to sleep in it, you understand. But I have kept the clever post. It holds flowers now in my new lodgings in Hampstead." Holmes, who was never ungentle where courage and wit had shown themselves, bowed with grave courtesy. "Your sister's device has served its purpose admirably. If the wood now bears roses instead of secrets, it will be the better for it." The broader resolution of the conspiracy had proceeded with the methodical efficiency that marked Mycroft Holmes's approach to governmental reform. Over the course of several months, 17 individuals had been convicted of various charges, ranging from fraud to treason, while the systematic examination of military contracts had recovered nearly £40,000 in fraudulent payments. More significantly, the oversight procedures implemented in the wake of the scandal had fundamentally altered the relationship between private contractors and military procurement. Holmes received regular updates on these developments through his brother's discreet communications, though he displayed little interest in the ceremonial aspects of governmental recognition. When invited to attend a formal ceremony at the India office, he declined with characteristic brevity. "The evidence speaks for itself, Watson. I have no need to hear it praised by those who ignored it for so long." The human cost of the conspiracy had been more difficult to quantify, yet certain gestures toward restitution had been quietly arranged. A memorial fund established in Colonel and Mrs. Ashworth's names would provide assistance to the families of officers who died in service, while the systematic review of suspicious deaths in the colonial service had led to the reopening of several cases previously dismissed as natural causes. Of Captain Geoffrey Hartwell himself, there was little more to be said. His execution had been carried out with the swift efficiency of military justice, yet his technical brilliance continued to fascinate Holmes in the abstract. He possessed genuine expertise perverted to evil purpose, Holmes observed one evening as he examined the final reports. In different circumstances, such capabilities might have served the Crown with distinction. As spring approached and London began to shed the last vestiges of winter's grip, Holmes received a visitor whose arrival would provide an unexpected coda to our investigation. Captain Markham, whose cooperation with the authorities had earned him both official commendation and private gratitude, called upon us bearing news of his new assignment. "I've been posted to the Staff College at Camberley," he announced with evident satisfaction. "They want me to develop new procedures for contract oversight, ensuring that the lessons of the Ashworth affair are not forgotten." Holmes nodded approvingly. "Prevention is indeed preferable to detection, Captain. Your experience with the conspiracy's methods will serve you well in that endeavor." As Captain Markham prepared to leave, he turned back with a question that had evidently troubled him throughout the intervening months. "Mr. Holmes, do you believe we caught them all? The network seemed so extensive, the connections so deep." Holmes considered the question with characteristic thoroughness. "We eliminated the active conspirators and exposed their methods, Captain. But corruption, like rust, requires constant vigilance to prevent its return. Your new position will be more valuable than a dozen prosecutions in ensuring that such systematic betrayal cannot take root again." The case of the secret buried beneath the widow's bed had reached its natural conclusion, yet its lessons continued to resonate through our subsequent investigations. Holmes had demonstrated once again that no crime, however impossible it might appear, could long withstand the methodical application of observation and deduction. More profoundly, we had witnessed the triumph of individual courage over institutional corruption, proving that truth, once properly preserved, cannot be destroyed by any amount of systematic deception. One evening in late March, as Holmes tuned his violin with characteristic precision, he offered a final reflection on the case that had so thoroughly tested our abilities. "Watson, we have learned that the most dangerous criminals are often those who provide us with convenient explanations, while they themselves remain invisible." Mrs. Ashworth understood this instinctively. She knew that her adversaries would think like engineers and soldiers, calculating structural possibilities and defensive measures. She thought like a woman who had learned that the most profound truths require the most unexpected sanctuaries. The music that followed, a haunting air by Sarasate, seemed to provide a fitting benediction for our investigation. Its mathematical precision echoed the methodical approach that had ultimately solved the impossible crime, while its emotional depth acknowledged the human cost of the conspiracy we had helped to expose. As the final notes faded into the comfortable silence of our sitting room, Holmes set aside his violin and reached for the Evening Post. Among the usual correspondence was a card bearing an unfamiliar address in Belgravia, its corner marked with a small symbol that immediately captured his attention. "Ah, Watson," he said with that familiar gleam of anticipation. "It appears that our recent publicity has attracted another impossible problem. The Countess of Morcar writes of a missing emerald, a locked library, and a butler who vanished into thin air. Shall we see if her ladyship's mystery proves as instructive as the widow's bed?" The gaslight flickered against our windows as London settled into the embrace of spring evening. But within our chambers at 221B Baker Street, the prospect of new mysteries provided the perfect conclusion to one of our most complex investigations. The secret buried beneath the widow's bed had been unearthed at last, revealing that even the most carefully constructed impossibilities must ultimately yield to the patient application of reason and the unwavering pursuit of justice. As we prepared for whatever challenges the morning might bring, I found myself grateful for the privilege of witnessing Holmes's extraordinary abilities applied to a case of such moral significance. Mrs. Ashworth's courage and foresight had triumphed over the engineer's technical brilliance, proving that truth, like the flowers now growing in her sister's careful tending, has a way of flourishing even in the most unlikely places. "Come, Watson," Holmes said, rising with that familiar energy that marked the beginning of new possibilities. "Mrs. Hudson has promised us a particularly fine dinner this evening, and tomorrow will bring fresh mysteries worthy of our attention. The game, as always, is afoot." The impossible had been explained, justice had been served, and the memory of a remarkable woman's final gambit would remain with us always, a testament to the power of individual courage in the face of institutional corruption, and a reminder that some secrets are indeed worth preserving at any cost. The spring of 1892 had transformed London from a city shrouded in conspiracy to one illuminated by the clear light of justice served. The fog that had so persistently cloaked our investigation seemed to have lifted permanently, as though the very atmosphere had been purged by the exposure of systematic deception. Holmes had returned to his customary pursuits with characteristic detachment from public acclaim. Yet I occasionally detected in his manner a subtle satisfaction that spoke of work completed to his exacting standards. It was on such an afternoon, with pale May sunlight streaming through our sitting-room windows, that Miss Victoria Pembroke paid us what would prove to be her final visit. She entered our chambers with the quiet dignity that had marked all our previous encounters, though I noted immediately the transformation that spoke of grief alchemized into purposeful remembrance. Gone was the deep mourning, attire of our earlier meetings, replaced by grey silk that suggested healing without the abandonment of memory. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she began, settling gracefully into the chair that had become associated with her presence. "I've come to share Cordelia's final words, and to complete a story that began with her courage and ends with her vindication." She produced from a worn leather portfolio a letter written in her sister's careful hand, its pages bearing the unmistakable marks of having been composed under considerable emotional strain. This was found among her private papers, sealed and addressed to me with instructions that it should only be opened should anything happen to her. It was written during those final weeks when she knew her life hung by the slenderest of threads. Holmes leaned forward with immediate interest, his grey eyes reflecting that peculiar intensity reserved for evidence of exceptional deductive reasoning. Miss Pembroke began to read from the document that would provide our final insight into the remarkable woman whose foresight had ultimately exposed such systematic corruption. Mrs. Ashworth's letter revealed the full extent of her understanding of the forces arrayed against her. "My dearest Victoria," Miss Pembroke read, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the words, "if you are reading this, then my precautions have failed to preserve my life, though I pray they may yet preserve the truth. I have learned that those who profit from war will kill to maintain their profits, and that no conventional hiding place can protect evidence from men who think like engineers and act like soldiers." The letter continued with detailed instructions for the recovery of the documents hidden within the bedpost, accompanied by observations that demonstrated Mrs. Ashworth's remarkable analytical abilities. She had correctly predicted that her adversaries would attempt to create an impossible crime, reasoning that the very impossibility would serve as camouflage for their systematic approach to elimination. More significantly, she had anticipated with startling accuracy the methods that would ultimately be employed against her. Remember, Victoria, the truth has a way of surviving even the most systematic attempts at its suppression. The strongbox beneath my bed serves as both repository and decoy. Let them spend their ingenuity upon it, while the real treasure rests where only love would think to look. If Mr. Sherlock Holmes should become involved in investigating my death, you may trust him completely. His reputation suggests a mind capable of seeing through the most elaborate deceptions. Holmes rose and moved to the fireplace, his tall frame silhouetted against the dancing flames. Your sister possessed a mind worthy of the most challenging criminal investigation, Miss Pembroke. Her analysis of the conspiracy's psychological methods was more penetrating than many professional investigators might achieve. She understood that the most dangerous hiding place is often the most obvious one, provided it requires the correct perspective to perceive it. As Miss Pembroke carefully folded the letter and returned it to her portfolio, she shared news that provided a fitting testament to her sister's legacy. The memorial fund established in James and Cordelia's names has grown beyond all expectations. Contributions have arrived from across the empire, from officers who served with James, from soldiers whose lives were saved by the reforms implemented after the scandal's exposure, and from civilians who simply wished to honor those who died defending the truth. The broader resolution of the conspiracy had proceeded with the methodical efficiency that marked Mycroft Holmes's approach to governmental reform. Over the subsequent months, 17 individuals had faced charges ranging from fraud to treason, while the systematic examination of military contracts had recovered nearly £40,000 in fraudulent payments. More significantly, the oversight procedures implemented in the wake of the scandal had fundamentally altered the relationship between private contractors and military procurement across the empire. Inspector Lestrade, whose professional advancement had been considerably aided by his role in the investigation, had taken particular satisfaction in ensuring justice for those initially wronged. The posthumous exoneration of Ezra Cole was formally recorded, and a modest subscription, quietly organized by Holmes and supplemented by Mycroft, had secured for Cole's aged mother a small annuity and for his apprentice the tools necessary to inherit the little workshop in Cheyne Walk. The apprentice himself had appeared at Baker Street one afternoon, bearing a carefully wrapped parcel. Within lay a plain iron, meticulously honed and burnished, accompanied by a note in careful script. For Mr. Holmes. Master said a tool ought to be square and true. He said you were that for him. Holmes had examined the implement with characteristic attention to detail before placing it upon the mantelpiece between a Persian slipper and his chemical apparatus. A reminder, he later observed, that there is art in squareness and mercy in true edges. Captain Markham, whose cooperation with the authorities had earned him both official commendation and a posting to the Staff College at Camberley, had developed new procedures for contract oversight that would serve as bulwarks against future corruption. His intimate knowledge of the conspiracy's methods, combined with his personal experience of its ruthlessness, provided invaluable insight into the systematic prevention of such betrayals. As evening approached and London began to embrace the comfortable rhythms of spring twilight, Holmes offered his final reflection on the case that had so thoroughly tested our abilities. Watson, we have witnessed the transformation of individual tragedy into systematic justice. Mrs. Ashworth understood that her death might be inevitable, but she ensured that it would not be meaningless. Her careful preservation of evidence, combined with her faith in the ultimate triumph of truth, created the foundation upon which all subsequent justice was built. He moved to the window, gazing out at the gaslit street where evening commerce continued its ancient patterns. The secret buried beneath the widow's bed was not hidden in the floor, as our adversary believed, but in the bed itself, in the very foundation of her final refuge. She understood that her enemies would calculate structural possibilities and acoustic properties, but they would never comprehend the sanctuary created by domestic intimacy and feminine intuition. Miss Pembroke rose to depart, pausing at our threshold with words that would remain with us long after her footsteps had faded on the stairs. I have kept the bedpost, as we discussed. It stands now in my garden in Hampstead, cut to a pleasing height and bearing white roses. Cordelia would approve. Her secret chamber has become a vessel for beauty rather than danger. As our visitor disappeared into the London evening, Holmes turned to me with that expression of quiet satisfaction I had learned to associate with his most successful cases. There, Watson, is an architecture worth leaving in the world. A bedpost and a balance sheet, truth preserved and justice served. Mrs. Ashworth designed a defense suited not to timber and iron, but to human nature itself, and in doing so, she achieved a form of immortality that transcends mere remembrance. The gaslight flickered against our windows as Holmes reached for his violin, preparing to conclude our evening with music that would provide a fitting benediction for our memories of the case. The melody that followed, a haunting air that seemed to capture both the tragedy of systematic corruption and the triumph of individual courage, filled our chambers with a beauty that transcended mere entertainment. As the final notes faded into the comfortable silence of our sitting room, Holmes set aside his instrument and reached for the evening post. Among the usual correspondence was a telegram bearing an urgent summons from the Countess of Morcar, whose missing emerald and locked library promised mysteries worthy of our renewed attention. "Ah, Watson," Holmes said with that familiar gleam of anticipation, "it appears that our recent success has attracted another impossible problem. Her ladyship writes of jewels that vanish from sealed rooms and servants who disappear into thin air. Shall we see if the Countess's mystery proves as instructive as the widow's bed?" The fog had lifted permanently from London streets, yet new mysteries continued to emerge from the city's ancient shadows. The case of the secret buried beneath the widow's bed had reached its natural conclusion, revealing that even the most carefully constructed impossibilities must ultimately yield to the patient application of observation and deduction. More profoundly, we had witnessed the triumph of individual courage over institutional corruption, proving that truth, once properly preserved, cannot be destroyed by any amount of systematic deception. As we prepared for whatever challenges the morning might bring, I found myself grateful for the privilege of witnessing Holmes's extraordinary abilities applied to a case of such moral significance. Mrs. Ashworth's courage and foresight had triumphed over the engineer's technical brilliance, demonstrating that some secrets are indeed worth preserving at any cost, and that the most profound truths often require the most unexpected sanctuaries. "Come, Watson," Holmes said, rising with that familiar energy that marked the beginning of new possibilities. "Mrs. Hudson has promised us a particularly fine dinner this evening, and tomorrow will bring fresh mysteries worthy of our attention. The game, as always, is afoot. But if ever I should need reminding why I set my feet to it, you must take me past Hampstead and let me see roses growing in a hollow post." The impossible had been explained. Justice had been served, and the memory of a remarkable woman's final gambit would remain with us always, a testament to the power of individual courage in the face of systematic evil, and a reminder that the most dangerous secrets are often hidden in the most intimate and unexpected places, waiting to be discovered by those with the patience to look beyond the obvious and the wisdom to understand that truth, like roses, flourishes best when tended with both love and vigilance.